Hello, everybody, and welcome to a South East Climate Alliance knowledge sharing event. And we're lucky to have Ben here with us tonight, talking about the great findings of Britain Talks Climate and how we can all learn a little bit more about this kind of climate communication. Because I know for many of us, you do end up talking in the same way to everybody, regardless of who they are. So, having a bit of clarification around the different kinds of people and who to talk to. So if there's anybody there that is not already signed up to the Southeast Climate Alliance or from out of the Southeast, then do put in the chat where you're from and say, of course, anybody that's not already signed up is welcome to through the Southeast Climate Alliance website. So over to you, Ben. Welcome.
Thanks, Nicola. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. Give me a sec. Can you see that? Yeah, great. Okay, so as Nicola said, my name's Ben. Apologies in advance. It's our charity's AGM tonight, and my other half is there, so I may be at some point joined by a 7-year-old who gets bored of designing dresses for dolls. So apologies for that in advance. And also, apologies that this is usually run in person. So this is one of the first times we've tried running it fully online, and it's usually in 2 sessions. And the second session is the quite interactive part. So this is quite a lot of talking at you, unfortunately, but it's kind of an essential part to. Hello. Bored already. She's off already. You okay? Okay. It's kind of the essential intro part to the rest of it, because until you sort of get your head around the framing and the Britain Talks Climate part of it, it's quite difficult to actually put it into practice. So apologies that it is me talking at you quite a lot, but we could look at how we you can take some of this away in another session and do some of the more interactive part with your groups yourselves. So to start off on what we're trying to get, what we're trying to achieve with this, and then I'll come back a little bit after that to talk about what we're doing in Surrey. Bless you, whoever that was. The sort of goal of this is to drive more engagement in your projects, so both in terms of getting volunteers as well as and users, as well as outside of that, trying to drive pro-environmental and low carbon behaviour in your wider community. To figure out ways that we can effectively counter a lot of the emerging anti-net zero narratives, which I think we need to be quite aware of. It is a very small minority of people doing that, but they're excellent at making their voices pretty loud. And we've had a couple of incidents of projects getting cancelled in Surrey because of that. So it's an important thing to try and counter. And thirdly, to try and bring enough people along as a majority to join up and push local authorities and government to be more ambitious in how we tackle the climate crisis locally. And also, if you were at the SECA conference a couple of months ago, sort of started off with a mini version of this session just by trying to ask some of the questions that we often really try and struggle to understand with engagement and projects in communities. That's why some projects fail and some succeed. You can have 2 quite similar projects in fairly similar locations, and one's quite successful and one never gets off the ground. Why we really struggle to make an impact with the people who most benefit from projects that we're running, how to get around something you've probably all heard many times. Oh, it's a great idea, but it'd never work in my town. All of us, I'm sure, have heard that quite a lot. And how we actually reach past preaching to the choir, talking to the same people over and over again, as Nicola said, holding events and having the same bunch of people turn up. So how we actually get past some of that. So if you're not familiar with the concepts in what we're going to talk about tonight, it's going to seem like a lot. It's a lot of information to take in. You're not expected to remember all of it or any of it. It is definitely not, a silver bullet that you walk away from tonight and be like, right, we've got this absolutely sorted. This is quite a long journey to try and figure out, with tonight being the sort of first step on it, hopefully, for a lot of you. It isn't super easy to do. The upside is that a few of us in Surrey have spent quite a long time trying to figure some of this out, and so we do have a little bit of a blueprint, which hopefully you'll see some of tonight. What I would say is to just go back to what I do a little bit. I am part of the charity Zero Carbon Guildford. About 4 years ago, during lockdown, started getting together people I knew were really active in certain local community groups, projects, and bringing them together to try and collaborate more, so that we had, so that we could share resources more, all be a bit less frazzled, try and join up a little bit better. And we registered a charity about 3 and a bit years ago. And then we took over a former New Look in September 2021. We made it all the way through a 2-year lease on that, operating a large town centre climate hub. So we had a 16,000 square foot space in there, which we did lots of projects in. During that time, we won the Innovative UK Community Project Award from the Climate Coalition. And then our lease finished last September, but at about the same time, we won a large contract for what will turn out to be about £250,000, which we've distributed through community groups in Surrey, trained people up, just trained normal residents up to go and do thermal imaging surveys and offer in-person advice to their communities, with the goal of obviously not just giving them a survey, but signposting them to retrofit assessors, funding that they might be eligible for, so that the call to action there isn't just have an energy survey, it's how we actually start decarbonising some of the homes in Surrey, which about 2/3 of which are EPC rated D or below or don't have an EPC. Since then, we've managed to secure a new premises, which opens on the 20th of April. So you're very welcome to come up to Guildford for that. So it's a really nice building in a lot better condition than the last one. And we've changed our strategy based on the last 2 years that we ran a space, in line with what I'm going to talk about tonight. And in the last month, we've just announced that we won £350,000 of National Luxury Reaching Communities funds. So we've had a really good few years. My paid work, we're mostly volunteers. We've got some paid staff now, thanks to the funding. My paid work is that I'm the engagement lead across the Greener Futures group at Surrey County Council, which I've been doing for about 2 years. I think it's exactly 2 years today, actually. So that is Greener Futures is strategic energy, natural environment, climate change, and then grants for decarbonising businesses. And when I started doing that a couple of years ago, there was only 2 people involved in engagement, one on schools and one doing everything else. And over the last 2 years, we've managed to build that so that we have about 100 people engaging on Greener Future projects. So they're not all employed by the council. There's about 7 people in my team. But what we do is create networks that help engage under the Greener Futures project. So, for example, we've got a small contract with Surrey Climate Commission, and they do some great work for us on engagement on the particular objectives, helping push forward what we're trying to do. We managed to have some underspend that we gave them last year, and they managed to fund about 35 projects with small grants through that, across a range of organisations, not just climate and environment organisations. And then we've just signed a contract with Community Energy South to help get a community energy company off the ground, which is moving really, really quickly. So what I'm saying is this is not to sort of blow my own or anyone else's trumpet. What I'm saying is we've had some pretty good momentum in a short space of time. And what I would put a large part of it down to is what is contained in this evening's discussion. So whilst it is a lot to take in, the point I'm making here, as I say, it's not trumpet blowing, it's to say I think it's had a huge impact on how much we've actually managed to achieve. And I'm not saying we've got it completely sussed, obviously still in a real pickle in terms of climate breakdown, certainly haven't got all the answers here. And I'm also not saying I'm a behaviour change scientist, behaviour change specialist, but we do work with a lot of behaviour change people from Uni of Surrey and elsewhere. And so a lot of this is based on the last 4 or 5 years of in-person engagement that we've been doing. So if you feel like this is a lot to take in, try and remember some of those positives that I've just mentioned, and that I really honestly do believe that a lot of what is contained in this evening is the reason that we've managed to have those pretty good successes in the last few years. So first of all, I just want to go over a bit of the background to inaction, and particularly on that sort of saying that we've heard so many times, it would never work in my town, and exactly why we think that, why we seem to think other people are so apathetic. So I want to do a quick quiz here. I can't see the chat, Nicola, so maybe you could read out some answers here. But in the chat, I'd like you to just put 2 figures, so X% and Y% in there, so we can have a little poll here. Firstly, of what percent of people you think in your own country would want to take action on climate change? So that is both personal and want their government to do more. So what percent of people do you think want action on climate change? Personal and more ambitious government together. And what percent of people do you think would donate 1% of their personal income to tackle climate change? So just in the next few seconds, pop some answers in the chat there, just as a little poll, just to see what people think. Maybe you can read them out for me, Nicola, because I can't see it easily.
So we got 75, 70, 80, 10, 70, 80, 10, 70, 3%, 75%, 70%, 90%, 75, 65, 75, 755, 50, 70, 10, 95, 25%, 80%, 15, 50, 5%, 70%, 15, 50%, 10%, 70%, 2%, 70%, 30% would donate, 85%, 30. So yeah, it's all round about, say, 75 to 85 people are saying generally
Quite a big, yeah.
want to take action, but a lot less to how many would be prepared to give 1%.
Yeah, quite a big range. So actually, the first part you were a lot closer than I expected to be. So this is from the first part is from a study in Nature of 130,000 people across 125 countries, and what they found across that survey was that 86% of people across those countries think people should take personal action to tackle climate change, and 89% think their government should be more ambitious in tackling it. But what's really surprising here is that 75% of people would actually contribute some of their income to tackle climate change, and 69% of those would donate 1% of personal income. So it's pretty high. And in Britain, even the 75% of, the 69% is still over 40% of people who would donate 1%. So it's pretty high. And then the last stat there is that from Office of National Statistics is that 63% of Brits feel somewhat or very negative when they think about the future of the environment. So the point here, and this is, but nobody thinks this, you guys have actually been pretty close, to be fair, but in the polling, there's about a quarter underestimate when people try and guess other people's willingness to contribute. So it's about a 25% underestimate of how much people think other people would be willing to do those three things. So people really underestimate other people's sort of position on what we should be doing about climate change. And on top of that, almost everything that we read about climate change is negative. So this really reinforces a lack of perceived willingness to act. And what's most important to come out of this is that a small increase in people's perception of what others will do actually results in a pretty significant increase of your own willingness to act. So when you see other people are likely to do something, it makes you much more likely to do something. We'll chat about that in a little second. But that's a really good introduction here to what we're going to chat about in terms of like socially normal behavior and actually getting out a lot of the message of what people are concerned about and what people are doing about it. So through the course of tonight, we're going to talk about this a fair bit. So to start with, we know from this and from the stats that we've got that apathy isn't the issue, right? We've got 80% of people in Britain that are worried about climate change, 60% who are very worried, and 60% or above who say we're already feeling the effects in the UK, that we should be a leader on tackling climate change, and that we need a local as well as a global approach. So apathy is not the issue. We also know that education isn't necessarily the issue, because we've got a high number of people who are concerned, who could pretty easily go and, you know, learn what they need to online if needs be. Yes, there's a lot of misinformation out there, but it's pretty easy to find what we need to if we're keen to look. So there's obviously further issues underneath that we need to dig a little bit deeper on. And what we find is that it's a complex set of reasons why people fail to act on tackling climate change. The top two, we've got coping mechanisms. Obviously, we all have these. Climate change is pretty overwhelming to think about. It creates a lot of negative emotions in us that make us turn away from it, from depression, anger, anxiety, fear, grief, whatever it might be. So we've all got these coping mechanisms that potentially stop a lot of us acting. And then implicatory denial, so that is governments, obviously, well, partly politicians are human most of the time as well. Might not always seem that way, but they also have their own coping mechanisms. But they've also got this sort of desire to keep the status quo going, as it were. And although there are some things we can do about those two things, what we're going to focus mostly on here, which we have power to do as community groups, through peer-to-peer interactions, through engagement with people, is focused on the bottom two. So the first one, tragedy of the commons, sort of the reverse of what we just spoke about on that quiz. That is, again, something we all do. What's the point of me doing it if nobody else is doing it? So why should I walk to work, get wet, walk past a queue of traffic, breathe in all the air pollution when everyone else is sitting in their cars nice and dry? And then the second one is identity. And obviously we've evolved to sort of fit into tribes for safety. We still do this. We're extremely social creatures, really worried about getting shunned by our own peer group. What's made it worse now, obviously, social media and media through, being funded by a lot of vested interests are sort of forcibly trying to coerce us further into these teams to stop any change to the status quo. So there's a number of reasons that these bottom two are a really important part of how we actually drive engagement forward. And to reinforce this, especially on the coping mechanism side, this is a really nice little slide. The first time I learned about Britain Talks Climate was in a Scottish Climate Action Network webinar a couple of years ago. And this just shows sort of coping mechanisms and actions. So we know that 60% of people think that climate change is already affecting us. But when we look at how people think it will actually hurt them, the further and further we get away from them personally, the more they think the risk is, right? So we know that's not true. We're already seeing effects, but the further you get away from yourself, the more you're inclined to believe it's going to be a problem. And it's not that, we don't need to figure out how to spread a bit better education, more targeted education, because there are public perception issues. So, for example, if we look at this little figure here, when people are asked what the most impactful ways to reduce emissions are, we get recycling come out as the top answer by a pretty significant margin. And actually, it's about the 60th most impactful one, whereas only 15% rank ditching your car in the top three. So there is clearly some issues around this, but actually what we need to look at is not just the information that we're just putting on a wall or presenting on a leaflet, but how we actually put some of this across in a conversation where we've got enough time to engage people in a meaningful way. And a big part of the issue there is how we actually frame a lot of these conversations within those of us that are working most to tackle climate change. And so that brings us on to the sort of bulk of what we're going to chat about tonight. And this is this brilliant piece of research by Climate Outreach. You might have heard of them. They have a free library of climate impact photos online, which are free to use. They're really good. They did a study of almost 10,500 British adults. And what they did was they took 40 odd questions focused on society, economy, etc. And within them, there were 16 golden questions about climate. So the answers of this study allowed them to determine that rather than what we think about in terms of a left-right binary, which is, always rubbed in our face with politics every day, etc., situation's quite a lot more complex than that. And actually what they found was there's 7 different persona types, 7 segments they call them, and all of them have somewhat unique motivating factors, shared values, and concerns about climate change. So all of them have different hooks of how you might engage them. So that's the sort of basis of what we're going to be chatting about tonight. And what you can see here is sort of how they break down. I've got the slides here of what each persona type is focused on. I'm not going to go through all these because you're not going to remember all this anyway, but I really recommend reading at least the summary when you leave here. It's fascinating. I went down a real rabbit hole with this, spent literally months brushing up on it. If you do a lot of climate engagement and outreach, it hopefully, like it was for me, will be a bit of a light bulb going on, and it will really help you pinpoint where things have gone well in the past and you weren't sure why, and where things you thought were pretty good suddenly went pretty badly down the toilet. So it's a real eye-opener in terms of understanding who you're engaging with. So a couple of things to sort of, I'll just glance through these a little bit. So civic pragmatists, for example, they are pretty likely to be quite community focused, dedicate to charity, would respond well to messages on collaborative action, we're all in this together sort of thing. Established liberals is a big section of the southeast, so this is typically a wealthier section of society. They're pretty empowered, obviously, because they're pretty secure, and they're really motivated by things like green economy messaging, for example, return on low carbon investment. Backbone Conservatives, obviously another big one in the southeast. Countryside preservation, big one for them. But there's a big sort of pride driver in this. So really proud of Britain and its history, and that's a real key part that we'll talk about in a little bit. There's a couple of disengaged sections, disengaged battlers and disengaged traditionalists. Loyal nationals, pride is another big one for these guys, but they also are really focused on local environment, fairness locally, really against basically unaccountable corporations. And then progressive activists, which typically most people dealing with climate change, environmentalism will probably fall into this or the civic pragmatist category. So what we see is that rather than just thinking about this in a left-right binary, it's a lot more complicated than that. And what we can do is use this to try and assess why so often when we think we've designed a really good campaign, really good bit of messaging, got a great project, it's not engaging with people, try and figure out what's going wrong. And so to take a bit of an example here, this is not exactly representative. This is just a nice visual key to show why thinking about things in a left-right binary falls apart, that people seem to respond to quite well. So if you take the green band there across the middle as the left-right spectrum, as I say, this is not exactly accurate because here, for example, the turquoise band of established liberals, they skew sort of right on economic things and left on social. But let's say, right, we take some sort of messaging about personal responsibility on tackling climate change. So let's say you're standing in the street or you're trying to engage people, and your main thing you're trying to get across is that people should get rid of a gas boiler and upgrade to a heat pump because it'll tackle climate change, for example. Let's just use that as a basic example. What you find there is that the parts of your messaging that are engaging there are tackling climate change to your climate activists and the long-term cost savings of getting renewable technology in the form of a heat pump to the wealthier group of established liberals who can afford that. But you probably haven't really landed much with these three sections here, the purple, red, and light blue. And you've probably alienated these two on the right here, the backbone conservatives and disengaged traditionalists. So you've probably alienated, at best not resonated at all, with more people than you've actually successfully engaged with here at 25%. But what makes this much, much worse is that these people are very likely the people who have already adopted the behavior that you're trying to get them to adopt. So those people have probably already done the thing that you want because they're either worried about climate change, or in this case, there's long-term cost savings to be had from employing renewable technology. So when we think we've designed something really good and maybe not peer tested it among other groups, and then we get very little response to it, this is probably a major pitfall in where we've got that messaging wrong. We've just not really thought about it outside that climate bubble, and so we've sort of fallen at the first hurdle. So the message, first thing to take away from this is that the message is absolutely critical, and it is not to just come up with something between a group of 10 to 20 of us and think it's going to resonate with everybody, because it's almost certainly not, given that there's seven persona types with different motivating factors here. The second point is the messenger that is used to deliver the message. And this is, again, from Britain Talks Climate. And there's a nice little slide on levels of trust, how much people across those 7 segments trust groups of people to deliver messages on climate change. And we can see what's quite good news is climate scientists is ranked top. David Attenborough is second, obviously pretty universally loved. It's quite hard to get him involved in your projects. Tried, it's not that easy. And environmental charities third, which obviously is good news for a lot of people here because you probably fall into this category. So there's still a pretty high level of trust with environmental charities. And then what you see here as well is ordinary people who have experienced climate impact. So that's a really important thing to remember in terms of trusted messengers going forward when we come back to talk about that. But this slide is in here because what you notice here is the disparity. The biggest disparity across all of these is the level of trust from people who fall into the progressive activist category. So that is pretty much all of us, most of us here, I would guess. And without the testing outside peer groups, what we find is that we pretty much, our messages resonate with each other, but they really fall on deaf ears, both trust-wise and in terms of shared values with all the other 6 segments. So this is a really important thing to remember, is it's not just the message, but it's the messenger delivering that, and how much trust other people from outside the bubbles that you're working in will actually have faith in that messenger, right? And how we can change that to start bringing people from these communities in, from the people that these people identify with, to deliver that message. That's an absolutely key part. So message, messenger. And bringing that together, what we need to do then is the way we're doing this in Surrey. And as I say, we haven't got all this figured out, but we've spent a long time trying to go through trial and error to get to a point that we think is working relatively well. And that is using behavior change to try and drive forward our projects, in-person conversations, displays, etc., etc. So the first thing we're going to look at here in terms of how we actually manage to bring enough people along in terms of building momentum is something called the diffusion of innovation graph. So this is usually used for like marketing purposes, tech uptake, but it's a really useful way to start thinking about social movements, because what we see is that so typically things break down in terms of popularity into these 5 segments. So first of all, we've got the innovators who are really willing to take risk, upstanders, put the head above the parapet, take the risk. And quite often in climate and environment stuff, we don't really get past this group where there's a small percent of the population of the local community doing something which, you know, everyone involved is pretty bought into, but we don't manage to bring enough people along to get critical mass. Sometimes we manage to get into this section where early adopters can see some of the benefits of what's going on. They need sort of less evidence to get on board with what it is. So, you know, they'll see what's going on. They'll understand the impact. If we think about it in climate change, in terms of climate change, we already know that we've got like 60% of people. So if we look at the numbers here, 2.5%, 13.5%, we could pretty much go right up to here to see the people who are very concerned about climate change, right? About that number of people are very concerned about climate change. So we know there's people in these sections that we could bring along to actually start taking action appropriate to the level of the crisis that we face, if we could actually find a way to do it, right? So sometimes we get into here and bring some early adopters on, but what we find is that there's this gap between early adopters and early majority, which is sort of known as the chasm. And it's just really, really difficult to jump that, because the early majority is much more mainstream. They need a lot more evidence to actually act. They need to understand what the benefits specifically are to them, have all of their concerns addressed, and really see what they're going to be getting involved with working for a number of other people, right? And this is what comes back to that social norming, making what we're doing like normal behavior to be getting involved in. So this is, as I say, it's not really used for this, but it's a really useful way to think about how we're trying to build momentum when we reach out past that climate bubble. And just to sort of emphasize some of this in terms of bringing that early majority along, this is just a fun little video to watch that puts it into a better way than I've just explained, in a more fun way. So we'll watch this and then I'll come back to you.
If you've learned a lot about leadership and making a movement, then let's watch a movement happen start to finish in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructional. This is key. He must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with a crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore. It's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. So it takes guts to be your first follower. You stand out, you brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower is an underappreciated form of leadership. The first follower transforms a lone nut into a leader. If the leader is the flint, the first follower is the spark that really makes the fire. Now here's the second follower. This is the turning point. It's proof the first has done well. Now it's not a lone nut and it's not 2 nuts. 3 is a crowd and a crowd is news. A movement must be public. Make sure outsiders see more than just the leader. Everyone needs to see the followers, because new followers emulate followers, not the leader. Now here comes 2 more people, then 3 more immediately. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point, and now we have a movement. As more people jump in, it's no longer risky. If they were on the fence before, there's no reason not to join in now. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, and they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. And over the next minute, you'll see the rest who prefer to stay part of the crowd, because eventually they'd be ridiculed for not joining. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how a movement is made. So let's recap what we've learned. If you are a version of the shirtless dancing guy, all alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals. making everything clearly about the movement, not you. Be public, be easy to follow. But the biggest lesson here, did you catch it? Leadership is over-glorified. Yes, it started with the shirtless guy, and he'll get all the credit. But you saw what really happened. It was the first follower that transformed a lone nut into a leader. There's no movement without the first follower. See, we're told that we all need to be leaders, but that would be really ineffective. The best way to make a movement, if you really care, is to courageously follow and show others how to follow. When you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first person to stand up and join in.
That's just sort of a fun way to put to show that diffusion of innovation in action there, really. And obviously we are like by their own what happens. People will just
Oh, Ben, we've lost you. It could be because you've got this video on. Maybe go to the next slide because you've seized. No, it seems like we have lost Ben. So I don't know if Ben, you can hear me. You might have to log out and log back in. Well, let's have a few comments on the leadership guy. I mean, does it show us that, you know, many of us feel alone?
My headphones.
We're the crazy one that's standing out there, waving our arms around. But, you know, after a while, you know, that momentum does pick up. And then other people, in the end, you're not the crazy one anymore because everybody's doing it. And I suppose that's really what that slide shows us, is that as long as if we just keep on and we gather momentum, and I think it's been a good example seeing, for instance, with Sussex Green Living, and you know, seeing how Carrie started small and now how many repair cafes and how many Wombles and how many villages, and it's just that growth. Ben's back. Great.
I'm so sorry. My
That's
internet
I was
crashed.
just rambling on a bit to cover until you came back.
Thank you. Thanks for the cover. I'm sorry, my internet just totally crashed there.
Yeah, it could have just been from the video at the same time. So over
possibly,
to you.
yeah. Sorry about that, everybody.
Share again.
Share again. Okie dokie. So in terms of research, background research of what we've got here, these are all things, before I disappeared there, I was saying that these are the sort of things that what we're chatting about tonight is based on. And this is a great book, for example. So the Scottish Climate Action Network webinar that I was on that I mentioned was being presented by George Marshall. If you were at the SECA conference a couple of months ago, you might have heard Jessica, who heads up MP Watch, talking about work that they're doing with George Marshall. And they are now looking to design engagement around the 2 disengaged types that I mentioned from the Britain Talks climate research. So that's a really fascinating thing to keep an eye on and to look at. These are things that I would go once we finish this. If you want to do more reading, these are really good things to look at for that. Bearing in mind that the 2 disengaged segments, what I want to do is talk about how in the southeast we have the potential to get enough people along to actually start that sort of movement building that we were looking at in that video in a slightly more sort of serious way. So we ran the Britain Talks climate research across Surrey. So we surveyed 1,100 people. And what we found was kind of what was expected, I suppose, is the southeast, it's Surrey. So typically we had, as expected, more backbone conservative persona types, more established liberals because it's a wealthier area, quite a lot of civic pragmatists. What was, I suppose, quite surprising, but maybe not that surprising because you typically find the 2 disengaged segments in probably lower income areas, is that we actually only have 13% in total of both disengaged types. So that is effectively a real positive for driving action on climate, because what it means is we've got potentially 87% of people in Surrey who are concerned and have the motivation and the capability to actually do something about climate change. So it's like higher than what we would look at in some of those figures. But we know again that there's this huge disparity between that number and the people who are actually acting. And so what we need to do is dig deeper again and figure out why they aren't acting, what it is, what are we getting wrong with the message, why have we got the wrong messenger, what are the barriers that we're actually seeing for people to take action. And so the way that we do this, how we bring in behavior change here, is to look at what's called a COM-B model. So if you've seen any behavior change before, you'll have seen this. If not, don't get, it's nothing to get overwhelmed about. It's fairly basic. COM-B, so COM, capability, opportunity, motivation. You need all three of those things to be able to drive the behavior change that you're looking to try and drive. Okay, so that's a COM-B model. And what we see here, because we've got these low numbers of disengaged people, is that we've actually got a pretty readily available audience to try and drive forward climate action locally. So if we were to map out this COM-B model on a graph, across here we've got motivation, so importance of taking action is people's motivation, and up here on the y-axis is their C, their capability, their ability to take action. And what we see when we plot these results onto a graph is obviously these guys, progressive activists, are already doing a lot on climate, and we're already probably mostly the ones writing the messaging, being the messengers on it. The guys down here, very little ability to take action, little motivation, because let's be honest, they've got a lot more on their plates to deal with than worrying about something they can't necessarily see happening right in front of them. So what we see here is that there's a pretty obvious sector to focus on who have both the motivation and the capability to take action, which means that rather than writing our own messages within groups that focus pretty much on ourselves, we need to think about how we start engaging this group of 4 persona types. And we at Zero, we call these the persuadables. We didn't come up with that name. It's from a climate creatives. If you've seen that, it's marketing professionals. They call these guys the persuadables, and it's a good way to think about how to engage people who are concerned and who have the capability and the motivation to act, and how we can provide that opportunity for them to actually take action. So that's what we're thinking about here. So I'm gonna ignore that slide for a second and come back to it because it's a lot of information. So when we start talking about doing things in public, making behaviors normal and finding the right message, right? What I want you to do is think about when you go to a hotel. You'll have all seen this. You go into a hotel bathroom and it says, help the environment, reuse your towel, something like that, right? That's a standard environmental appeal. So the slide that I'm going to show you next shows the difference, a very slight tweak in how you change that wording from just a standard environmental appeal to a normative appeal, where you make it really clear that lots of people are already taking action. So people feel like that is the social norm and they need to be doing it as well, right? So what we see here is the first message, help save the environment by reusing your towel. And then this study put a second message in other hotel rooms, which said, join your fellow guests in helping to save the environment. Almost 75% of guests who are asked to participate in our new resource saving program do so by using their towels more than once. And what this resulted in was a 25% increase in towel reuse. So from the descriptive norm, the normative appeal, that increased towel reuse over the standard environmental appeal, because people felt like, oh, well, everybody's doing it. It's just normal behavior. Obviously, I should be doing this as well. And then what's interesting is a provincial norm was added as well. So the provincial norm here is almost 75% of guests who stay in this room help by using their towels, and that reusing their towels more than once. And that increased it to nearly a third, right? So the more specific we get with how much we make this normal behavior within a community, within a small society or what have you, the more it drives that increased behavior change. And this comes back to the little quiz at the start of that willingness to contribute. If we see other people are doing it, it makes us more likely to do it. Now, one of the really interesting things about this part down here is that all this behavior happened behind closed doors. And this is really important because it isn't just like a fear of being publicly shunned by doing something inappropriate in public. This is actually such a strong thing within us that when we see these like normative appeals, the descriptive norms, it still influences what we do when nobody else is looking at us, which is a really important thing to take away. So this has big implications for things like food waste, heating use, all these sort of things that take place in people's homes. And then the last point to make is that a separate group in the study identified more specific provincial norms, like being a citizen or being male, female, what have you, as being more powerful, obviously, than a hotel guest. So the more specific you can make it to your own community, the more likely it is to actually drive this increase in behaviour change. So I realise there's a lot of writing on that slide, but that is the key takeaway. The more you can make this normal behaviour within a community, the more chance you've got of actually ramping up engagement quickly. And that obviously, that when we ran this before, someone asked, well, are we just supposed to make up numbers? Obviously, that is not the case here. But what we can start doing is running surveys out in the public, not just in our own peer group again, but out in the public to get some of these numbers that we actually need to see what our local community thinks about some of this, so that we can use these normative appeals. So that's a really key part moving forward, the last sort of part before I move on to how we tie all of this together and what we've talked about. And again, if this feels like a lot at the minute, don't worry about it. I'll give you the slides. We can chat this through again. Anyone who's interested in this, happy to speak. But this is how we can tie it together in terms of how we rethink engagement. So what we've talked about in a way there so far is people's motivations, the shared values within those persona types and how some of them overlap across other persona types, calls to action. And it's important to emphasize that's calls to action, because we've already seen there's a lot of differences in capability and motivation. So if we have a project where we say, here's a problem and here's how you solve it, if you're only giving people one option, you are not going to be getting enough people involved, because there will be a lot of barriers to some people potentially taking that action. So calls to action, multiple calls to help people resolve some of the barriers, depending on what they are, which could be numerous, is really important. Focusing on local impacts is something we're going to talk about in a minute. And then amplifying reach, which is really key, because particularly word of mouth can act as a really strong trusted messenger. And this applies in pretty much everything we do. So our websites, broadcast media, social media, the displays, if anyone's got a climate hub, I know there's one in Lewis, the conversations that we have when we're out about on the streets, particularly conversations, because a lot of topics around climate change need to be pretty nuanced in terms of how we talk about it, so that we can actually bring people in. And remember, the key here, right, is that we are talking to people that we may only get a fleeting chance to talk to. So the goal is not to send somebody away, with a placard in their hand and you convert them to a climate activist. That is, if you read the Entangled Activist book there, you'll see that's going to be almost impossible if they don't already identify as an environmentalist. But it is to get them thinking about how climate change will impact the things they love and what they should do about it. So the goal here is to not lose them in the first couple of sentences. That should just be your first goal. How you start conversations, so you can actually build a bit of a relationship in that chat, and you can leave those people with something to think about as they go away from it, right? And the first thing we need to think about to do that is something that I think we're probably all pretty guilty of, and that is framing climate change as an environmental issue when it isn't just an environmental issue, right? It's first and foremost a health crisis, it's an economic crisis, it's a social crisis. And so this is a real key thing that we all need to get our heads around, really. And the example that I use for this quite often, and when I start talks to rooms of a room full of people that I don't know, so obviously, coming to a Climate Alliance talk, you pretty much know who you're speaking to. But I quite often do talks with a room full of people, and I've got no idea what their motivators are, what sort of values they have, what of those persona types they would fall into. So what I try and do is go for a bit of a catch-all, depending on what I'm talking about. And traffic is the way that I think it's easiest to explain this, right? Because yes, it's a difficult one, because it needs a huge amount of investment in infrastructure plus a lot of behavior change. But if we take how I might start a conversation on transport, I could, and I would have done this as well. I would have done this loads of times until I started getting a little bit more practice at this. But I would have been encouraging people to get out of their cars to reduce emissions. And that would have been the grand total of what I said as an introduction for some of this, right? But that would fall flat on a lot of people. So when we actually look a bit deeper, and this does take a bit of research to find out information locally, but when we look a little bit deeper, right, Surrey is in the top 5 traffic hotspots for all of England. We're worse than almost every London borough because of the congestion charge and ULEZ. And also, obviously, people have multiple cars in Surrey. So if you walk around Guildford, for example, it's not surprising. It's awful traffic there. But what we see, aside from the emissions, and that's actually 43% of emissions now it's responsible for since the last climate change delivery plan. Aside from the emissions, the Surrey economy loses £550 million every single year just from people being sat in traffic. Our air pollution related deaths are higher than the national average at 5.7%. And that's despite the Southeast having better healthcare than most of the rest of the UK. Surrey's actually got the 4th and 7th best hospitals in the country, but our air pollution deaths are still much higher. And in Guildford, where obviously the charity's based, we have a section of road, the A3, where it cuts. I don't know what town planner did this, but it just cuts right through the middle of town. It's almost double the nitrogen dioxide levels of any other stretch of road. It's so high there that national highways have intervened to start putting some air pollution measures in there. And where it cuts through town, the life expectancy in the north part of the borough is 8 to 10 years lower than the rest of the borough, which is unbelievable for a town of 130,000 people. Now, that isn't obviously just traffic related. There's a social aspect to that. It's a bit of a food desert, less access to fresh fruit and veg. A lot of GPs have been shut there as well, so there's worse healthcare. But if I start a conversation talking about traffic with all of these factors, I can tie in not just emissions, but economy, health, and the social factor. It means I'm much less likely to lose people right at the off than if I just say, get out of your car because we need to tackle climate change, right? I've got a little hook there where most 90% of people are probably like, oh, I didn't know that. That's quite interesting. And it's something that I'm concerned about, or, something I didn't know and I would like to do something about, basically. So that catch-all means you don't lose somebody right at the start. And when we try and think about this, these are from Britain Talks Climate. These two tables, if you take away anything from Britain Talks Climate stuff this evening before you go off and read it, these two tables are really interesting to take away. Because what we're looking at here, right, is the 7 persona types and what their biggest worry about climate change is. And within our own, this is what I'm talking about, messaging within our own group. So I'm guessing you've probably all done this loads of time as well, right? Is when we speak to a group of people we don't know and we talk about climate justice and what's happening in the global south. And that's absolutely correct, right? It's 100% factual to say all of these things, right? But if we're trying to reach outside of the climate bubble, then what we can see is that over here, these 3 groups nationally represent 50% of the population. So if we lead with that, we've pretty much lost 50% of people right from the first sentence, right? Now, this doesn't mean giving up your own values, but what it does mean, for example, like if we look here at disengaged traditionalists, which on their own are a fifth of people, and nearly a fifth of people, 18% in the UK, they actually rate not worried about climate change higher than what you've just said, if that's what you've led with. So that's a fifth of people straight away that aren't going to bother listening to you. So what we need to do, what's the second interesting part of this here, is that clearly here, there is a pretty unifying message here, and that most people are very worried that climate change will impact nature and wildlife. That is across the other 6 persona types, the joint, like number 1 across all of them. So straight away in a pretty wooded part of the country, that is a decent way to lead with this sort of, well, we'll come on to that bit in a minute, but this is a decent way to lead conversations where you don't know who you're talking to. Because if you start with this, suffering for the world's poorest, you're going to lose at least 50% of people. But if you start with this, you've got much more of an opportunity to engage someone in a conversation where you can come back to some of the other important things, but you haven't lost them straight away. Now, the second thing to note is that across here, across what I called the persuadables before, the number 3 on all 4 of those is negative impact on children's future. And I'm going to come on to this now, but this is effectively what we could call a shared destiny narrative, right? So it's thinking about the impact that something loads of us share. We all have a young person, a child, a grandchild, a nephew, a niece, whoever it might be that we care about and we're worried about their future, right? So this is a really unifying message. The key thing here is to not frame this in a way that makes people think it's a problem for the future. This is a problem for right now. Like, we are pretty screwed right now, and we need to deal with this problem now so that the impact on our kids' future is minimized, right? So that is a tricky little part to get around, but this shows a really good way that you can frame something that across nature and wildlife and kids' futures sets us up with a good way to start chatting to people when we don't know who we're actually engaging. And I'm going to talk about the next slide again because it's a bit confusing to look at. But effectively on the next slide, what we're going to see is a study of 3,500 people, right, that turns what is effectively a poll here into practice on the ground, right? So what we did, what happened in this next study is 3,500 people were interviewed, and there was one control group, and they were just given a paragraph with a bit of blurb, which finished with the call to action: government should do more on climate change, right? That's the control group. So they weren't given any type of message. We look at all the messages in here and what people could be told. They weren't given any type of that message. They were just given a little intro paragraph, finishing with government should act on climate change. Then there was 10 more groups, and each one of those groups just saw one message. So everyone in group 1 saw one message, everyone in group 2 saw a different message, and so on. And all of the messages were themed around things that we see in Britain Talks Climate. And what we see here, sorry, I've actually skipped a slide accidentally there. What we see here is that compared to the control group, on the shared values that we've just talked about, where they actually resonate with people, there was a significant uptick in how much people agreed with the sentiment government must act on climate change. So the paragraph was reworded to include one of these things. So for example, group 1 had a paragraph about climate impacts on them, and then it finished with a call to action, and that saw a 12% increase on how many people agreed with it. So we can see it's not just, this poll that Britain Talks Climate has done. This has been shown into action of who's actually how much the uptick is when you put these messages in. And this is really valuable to us as community groups, because when we don't know who we're talking about, if we talk about climate impacts compared to what our original message was, just about climate change, how much people should act, we now have a 12%, we're now engaging 12% more people potentially. So I accidentally skipped a slide, but the second table to look at from Britain Talks Climate is what's important when deciding when to vote. And we can see here, unifying factor here, healthcare. So again, this is really handy because, as I said, the climate crisis is a health crisis. So this is a really good way to frame things when you don't know who you're talking to. And then right across the second part here, across these 6 persona types, we see the economy and cost of living. So again, if we can figure out a way to frame some of this. So for example, right now, extreme weather is costing us X amount. If we don't act, climate change is going to cost us Y amount in healthcare. These are really good ways to start framing some of this. So apologies, I missed that slide out there. This is putting that into action. And what's really important to note here is that the biggest impact is across what we call shared destiny narratives, right? So like sort of we're all going to face the same thing. So this comes down to future generations, climate impacts locally, and again, these social norms here, right? The rest of them we could call, and natural world, so wildlife and nature. The rest of them are more like co-benefit narratives. And what we see is that although co-benefits are quite highly agreed with in polls, they don't necessarily change people's behavior outside of that. Whereas if we can engage people with the shared destiny narrative and add some co-benefits in there, it's much more likely that those people actually go off and do something about it, or get involved in our projects, or go and speak to other people about it. And what's really interesting here, and this, apologies, but this graph gets more confusing now. But what they then did, the next graph is to show us swing voters and the difference against this national average. So this is the national average that we're looking at here. If I go a graph ahead, the turquoisey color on the left of each one is the national average. But what this shows us is swing voters in the over 40s and non-graduates. And these are likely to be the people that we have lots of down here. So loyal nationals, established liberals, backbone conservatives, who we could engage on climate, but currently with the wrong messages and the wrong messengers and the lack of that social norming, we're not managing to do. And what we can see, especially on these shared destiny narratives, is in these groups, it's actually higher than the average. So climate impacts on over 40s, 14% swing in government should act on climate change. So that's a lot. Global leadership, and I mentioned pride before, right? None of what I'm talking about tonight means you have to give up on your own values. It doesn't mean you don't have to care about climate justice as much as you do now. What we're saying is that we need to reframe how we talk about things. So when we look at pride in, say, backbone conservatives and loyal nationals, I am not saying, give up what you believe, put a Union Jack suit on and shout about how great Britain is on climate, because that is just not true at all, right? But what we can do is reframe something. So rather than starting a conversation and saying Britain's doing a terrible job on tackling climate change, right? That might be true. By all metrics, it might be true. But if we do that at the start of a conversation, we immediately lose that chunk of people who we know are persuadable, right? But if we reframe that and we start the conversation by saying, well, Britain's done some really good things on climate change so far. We were the first country to introduce a legally binding net zero target. We're the first country to introduce TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. But if you look at Climate Action Tracker, not a single country is an exemplar in reaching the Paris Agreement goals. And so there's a real opportunity here for Britain to be a leader in tackling climate change, providing jobs within certain sectors, bringing more consumer benefit, bringing energy independence through renewables, And what we do there is we've just reframed that slightly. We're not giving up our own values. We're just saying, well, we've done some good things. Overall, we're pretty crap. Here's an opportunity where your pride really comes into play, because we could be a leader in this and it will tie in more of these co-benefits. So it isn't really saying a lot more than saying, well, Britain's pretty crap. It's just reframing it in a different way that brings in more of these narratives, particularly around the shared destiny narratives. So, social normings, natural world, climate impacts. So what I'm not saying is give up what you believe in. What I'm saying is reframe things slightly so that you aren't losing people straight away, and you're using as many of these messages. It's typically about 4 or 5 messages that you want to try and drop in to try and engage as many people as you can. Okay, so hopefully I haven't lost you all there. I realize these are somewhat confusing slides. Spent about half an hour going through this in the in-person workshop because no one really got the slides. So hopefully you're not too lost, but if you are, you're not at all alone. The second interesting part here is in the same study. This is going to be the last slide of these, don't worry. In the same study, they actually looked at what impact framing it this way had on net zero policy, and they actually saw a decent reduction in objection to net zero policies. So by framing it around these things, there was across the board a reduction in opposition to the big 6 policies to tackle climate change, like getting rid of the petrol and diesel cars. So that is a really interesting thing to bear in mind here as well. It's not the main point to take away, but this actually does have multiple benefits when you can frame it this way. Understanding what people's motivators are, and until you get good at understanding who the person is you're talking to, using these catch-alls and bringing in a shared destiny narrative alongside some co-benefits, it can make a huge difference, as this shows. Okay. It's a lot, I know. In a minute, I'm going to get you to do an exercise and stop talking at you. You'll be relieved to hear. So when we look at, we've talked about what people's motivations are, but we obviously need to turn those motivations, as we've said, into calls to action. And to get people acting, we know that it will and won't work in a certain way. So we've already discussed shared values and actually getting people to think about climate change and how it will impact them, the people and places that they love, so that they need to act on it, right? They're motivated by joy. They are not going to do something if it's a second job. And I think you'll probably all be well aware of this. We are really struggling at the moment to find somebody to help our finance trustee, because we've got loads of good stuff that happens in the charity. Going and helping with the accounts is, apologies to any accountants here, but it's probably not the most fun thing to be doing in your spare time. It's just a second job, right? So nobody wants to have a second job being joyful. And this is one of the good things about Take the Jump as well. It's all about joy, right? And you guys probably know this a lot. If something's fun, you're way more likely to have people get involved. Authentic stories and a sense of belonging, absolutely crucial. So authentic stories, an example I use, right, is we have a Conservative councillor in Surrey Heath. He, as pretty much a bet in a cabinet meeting, said, well, I could live without my car for a year if I had to. And people said, well, go on then. And he did it for a year. And now he pretty much never drives anyway. He's got an electric bike, absolutely loves it. He's a massive advocate for active travel. Him going talking to Conservative voters about getting out their cars in Surrey Heath is a million times more impactful than me going and doing that as a climate officer who, they don't identify with at all. So that the authentic stories from trusted messengers that they identify with, absolutely crucial. All the flip sides of that is what people aren't motivated by: blame and guilt, doom and gloom, hypocrisy, loss of self. And one common thing that comes up here is how a lot of us got into, I think, climate action, and that probably was something to do with guilt or anger or something like that. And don't get me wrong, those are really powerful motivating emotions and factors, but they're motivating when you come to it yourself, right? No one is motivated when you try and guilt them into something, or when you are trying to make them angry about something. It just doesn't work. They've got to come to that themselves. So people often think, well, actually, it's a huge motivating factor, but it's only that way when you come to that yourself. And you probably all know people who might go out and stand on the street and they're pretty angry. They've probably never converted anybody to doing the actions that they want, the behavior change that they want, because of the way they put it across. We've got a great example in Guildford, who's actually got restraining orders from going into schools. Very much doubt she's ever converted anybody to what she wants, because you have to arrive at those emotions yourself. So these 4 points on the left are absolutely key. And then the last point, just before we move on here, we talked about local impacts. This is a great place to start in terms of how we look at this shared destiny narrative, because we are all going to be impacted by some of these things. Lots of people already agreeing that we are being impacted. but they're a great way to tie some of the solutions and the positive stories in as well. So just most of these are sort of relevant to Surrey, but in the last couple of years, we've had the Woking to Basingstoke line collapse from a landslide. Now, this is really important because a lot of us around here are in commuter towns. So when you think about those catch-alls, that is a big impact on our economy potentially. I know a lot more of us work from home now, but obviously if we can't get into where we're going to work, then it has a huge impact on our economy. Plus travel, leisure, all of that side as well. That's the middle one is a wildfire at Wentworth, and I use this. I was going to say I like this picture. I don't like the picture at all, but I use this picture because I think it's like such a ridiculously good metaphor for what's going on at the minute. Like there's literally people just carrying on playing golf while the world around them burns. It's unbelievable. But we had a great trusted messenger at the launch of the Surrey Adapt. It's Surrey County Council's adaptation and resilience strategy. We had one of the fire chiefs come. Obviously, that is a great trusted messenger. Everybody loves people, the emergency services as being local heroes or what have you. He told us in that. They had to put out a wildfire in January. It's the first time ever in their history they've ever had to deal with a wildfire in the winter. Now, if that's not a good trusted messenger talking about local impacts of climate change, I don't know what is. It's like unbelievable. He said they were in shock that they had to deal with it. And then the third picture there is flooding in Godalming, which obviously is a bit literally my road is flooded today. Really common, I think, in a lot of parts of where we are. So these are all really good ways. I mean, obviously, they're all pretty horrific to look at, and the fact that we're going through them now, but they are all local impacts that we can use as this starting point for a shared destiny narrative. We're all going to suffer the same thing. If it's this bad now, think about what it's going to be like for our kids. But here's an alternative that will create jobs, will provide energy independence for hundreds of local residents through clean energy generation. There's lots of opportunities in these things to reframe them. So it's a lot of sort of despair, but a lot of hope sort of married together almost, as it were. That's sort of a key part of wedding these stories together. I'm going to stop talking at you for a minute because, as I said, it was a lot of talking at you. So I'm going to get you to do a little exercise now. And this will probably be quite challenging. It is intentionally quite challenging. But if you could grab a pen or paper, this is basically to start thinking about the pitfalls in what you do. And at the end of this, I've probably got about 10 more minutes after this, and then we can have a bit of discussion. The last few slides are resources that we use in our workshops for this, which I'm really happy to give you all. You can fill them in to suit your own groups, your own projects. Hopefully they will make sense by themselves, but I'm happy to sort of we could do another session where we run through how we run the second engagement session that we do on this. But this is to start thinking about the sort of combi model, right? Because what we're looking at in all our projects, displays, etc., is providing capability, opportunity, and motivation. So I've got an actual worksheet for this, but I couldn't figure out how to share it well. So I've taken some of the parts of the worksheet out, put it into questions here. So if everyone wants to spend, say, what time is it? I've gone a bit behind. If everyone wants to spend, say, 5 to 10 minutes thinking about this, firstly, just take one project, not everything you do, take one project. It's too much to think about everything you might be involved in. One project. Is it a repair cafe, a community fridge, river quality testing, whatever it is? What's the objective of that project? What are you actually trying to achieve? And who are you trying to engage? Is it everybody in your community? Is it a specific demographic? Who are you actually trying to reach? And then just write, and you'll come up with probably dozens of these. We won't have time for dozens, but what are all the barriers that might stop people get involved in the project? So this could be volunteers, it could be beneficiaries, it could be just people spreading the word about it, right? And there's 3 types. We mentioned the barriers here: capability barriers, opportunity barriers, motivation barriers. You don't have to go into that much detail. You can just write down what stops people. So for example, my project is in the middle of the countryside. It's really hard to get there without driving, and anyone who hasn't got a car is excluded from it. Whatever you can think of, right? And we don't necessarily have to talk through any of these. It's just to get you thinking about this. And then to think about, well, do you have the power or a pathway to actually overcome any of these barriers? Because if not, is your project actually focused on the right thing? And then finally, if you get a bit of time, what messaging you use on the project and how you could tie in. Seems like a lot, but this isn't going to take ages. If that's confusing, I'm going to use a little example here. So we're about to open our new space, New Zero, and we've got a active travel display, which at the moment is just lines on a floor because the chap who's running it has just sort of stumbled onto behaviour change through a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about. We had a cabinet office behaviour change specialist come and talk to us about active travel at work because it's such a big challenge, and I linked her up with a couple of people that run some of our displays, and it's really got them thinking about things in a different way. So if we took an example of active travel, right, what is that project trying to do? Are we just putting information in Zero on a wall about transport and air quality, right? And is lack of information the problem? Because if we're just saying, like I spoke about before, you shouldn't use your car because you're contributing to climate change, right? What good is that actually doing? How is it going to help the person not do that? So well, if we're putting information on a wall, what are the barriers to people actually taking up active travel? How are they going to get out their cars? Is there enough buses? Are they confident enough on bikes? Do they feel safe walking and cycling? Are there any cultural blockers, for example, what sort of clothes they wear? And I already know from this that because we had a space for 2 years, the vast majority of people do not feel safe cycling in Surrey. That is totally fair. It's an absolute horror show in most places. I used to cycle everywhere as a kid. No way would I let my kids cycle on the road outside my house. It is really, really dangerous. But we aren't the transport authority, right? And we do know what our local authorities' transport policies are, but they are not being enacted. They're basically not really doing anything. So what are we really left with doing here as an active travel display? Like, what are we actually asking people to do? If we're saying get out your cars, get on your bikes and that, how are we actually helping that if they just can't, if they don't feel safe, right? Is there even a point in having a display about that? Is there a point in standing on the high street and talking to people about that? Or would we be better just putting that aside, right? Putting some GoPros on our heads and going out and cycling routes into town that don't go on roads, and then working on that so that we can actually show people, well, you actually can cycle into Guildford without ever having to go on or across a road, right? So that is the key thing to start thinking about, because if we're just going to do the first thing and put posters on a wall saying transporting, and this was what our old display in Zero was like, actually, here's how much emissions come from transport in Surrey, and here's all the better options, train, cycling, etc. There was nothing to actually make people do anything other than what they were actually doing. So what was the point? Totally pointless, basically. So what I'm going to go back up to the thing, just take 5-10 minutes, just if anything, for me to stop talking at you, because you probably had enough of me, and just think about these things. And if anybody wants to share afterwards, very welcome to. Otherwise, we can just have open discussion at the end where people can reflect. But this is to just think about how you're framing projects and whether they're actually landing in the right way. We'll just take 5 minutes for this, I think, so we can have discussion at the end. Is that all right, Nicola? I'm actually just going to check my 7-year-old's not up to mischief. I'll be back in 2 minutes. Well, hopefully everyone's getting on okay. I'm not sure how long that's been. Do you know, Nicola? Is that 5 minutes? Ish. I'll give us a couple more minutes there, I think, in the chat. So yeah, no probs. Oh, it's Jeff.
So I see that Nikki has shared his experience from Devon. So does anybody else want to put in the chat to share, or Ben, did you want people to
Yeah, that
come
might.
off as mute?
No, that might be useful actually. If anyone wants to put in the chat, or if anybody wants to sort of chime in, that's fine. I realise it's not an easy exercise to have sprung on you at the best of times. This is actually the sheet that I will give you as a resource if you're up for using it. Is more of a sort of group brainstorming session. So in a project group, sort of sitting down and mapping all of this out together, and what the project's objectives are, and all of these barriers, and then particularly how you're actually going to get over them. Because you don't have to have the direct power, obviously, to do them, but you've got to have some pathway to do something about it. I think otherwise, maybe it's better to, take a step back and look at what barriers you can solve. So yeah, if anybody wants to chime in, you're very welcome to, or you can pop something in the chat. And then, as I say, I think I've probably got about 10 more minutes that you're gonna have to listen to me, and then half an hour for chat or what have you. Is that all right, Nicola?
Yeah.
Cool. Oh yeah, Justine, very welcome. If you come on the 20th, that's our opening day. So there's loads of stuff going on. So 20th of April is Zero's new opening day. Right, I'll crack on then if no one wants to chime in, and we'll have time for questions afterwards, so that's fine. So what I want to do now is turn this into, we've obviously sort of spoken a lot about how you can do this. I'm going to give you a practical example of how you actually can make this work, because it's one thing, chatting through strategy or what have you. It's another thing actually turning it into something. So first of all, when you're designing a project, a display, whatever, and thinking about the messaging you're using, it's really important to think about how people find you and what they then next see, and how you normalize what you're trying to get them to do. So firstly, think about how somebody found your message, right? So if, for example, I go and put so I used to renovate houses, so I know lots of builders. I'm a qualified plumber, so I know lots of people who might hang out, say down a working man's club, for example. So let's say I go and put a poster in a working man's club, right? Free training for plumbers to become heat pump installers, right? We have that in Surrey. We've got grant funding to train people up to be heat pump installers. If I go and put that in a working man's club, right, and that's something that people see and they scan a QR code or they search the website, and then the next thing they land on the website is, let's say, I don't know, an eco play, for example, like environmentally themed play, the chances of them, like the incongruousness, let's say, because I can't say the actual word, of that messaging flow will just make them switch off, right? They'll be like, what's this? This isn't what I signed up for, right? So you've got to make sure, however someone found your message that you want them to see about a particular behavior change, that the next thing that they see is completely consistent with that hook, and then it actually drives them the way that you're wanting to go. Because if it's not, they're probably just going to click away. And we see this in loads of things that we're running as well. Even if there's like one click out or something without a direct request, people often won't do it. So they won't do the action that you want to because it's one more click away. The next thing is how you generate stats to normalize behavior. So I mentioned that we'd done the Britain Talks climate research in Surrey. One of the really good stats that came out of that was that 68% of Surrey residents, so this is even Surrey, right? Even in Surrey, 68% of people rank taking environment on climate and taking action on climate and environment as extremely important or very important. So that's a pretty high number for Surrey. I think that's pretty good. That's a general one. But within your project, what are you doing that shows how many people are using that service, how many volunteers you've got, how many people it's benefiting, etc., etc. That's really important, trying to get those numbers, because it's good to show photos of people doing stuff and having a good time, but it's also important that people see how many people are already doing it, as we've discussed lots of times. And then the next thing is the trusted messenger appropriate to the audience? So I spoke about the guy who gave up his car for cycling. The better the trusted messenger, the better you're going to get engagement on that, right? And ultimately, if you can get something going that has a lot of word of mouth spreading about it, all the better. And I'm going to run through a little example of one of our specific projects on this at the minute. But what we do when what we're trying to, well, sorry, at least what we're going to do in Zero now, how we're theming all of our projects, all of our displays, is that they all need to contain or should contain all 6 of these things on the right here. Now, it might be really difficult for some of them, and if you can't get all of them, then fair enough, but at least have a crack. So the first absolutely crucial thing, as we've discussed, is the shared destiny messaging, which is tailored to like a shared value of those persuadables, right? We've already got all the people who are taking action on climate doing stuff. We've got 200 volunteers in Zero. There's no way we're engaging more than, let's say, tops 5% of the Guildford population. How are we going to get to the next lot of them, right? So what shared values are we going to use for that? So the shared destiny messages come back to those climate impacts, nature and wildlife, social norms, and impact on future generations. And then to support that, what are the impactful and appropriate co-benefit messages? What is it that we're trying to say about the thing? What are those benefits that go alongside that? And climate will always be one of those. It's important to have that thread running through it all the time to keep people thinking about, oh, actually, climate really ties into that other thing that I was thinking about. But it doesn't necessarily have to be your top thing, right? The normative appeals, X amount of people are already doing this thing. Why aren't you doing it already? It's completely normal around here. You should all be doing it. The trusted messenger, who delivers it, and the calls to action. As I said, calls to action. Because if you just offer one thing to do, a lot of people are going to have barriers to do that. And if you can track how many people do that, all the better. So for example, if you're getting people to sign up to something else that somebody runs, can you speak to that organization and ask them to track the link that's coming from you so that you know what success your messaging is having against other things to send people there? And then the last thing, and this is not always possible, but is continual escalation through networks. And this is just a tiresome process of building a lot of, a big collaborative network. And I know lots of you here are probably already really good at doing that, but we're not always as good at getting things out through those networks in a successful way. So I'm going to walk you through the example of how we're doing this with a specific project, right? So all these things on the right here are now transferring to the left, and here is the thing in action, right? So I mentioned before we got a big funding pot to run in-person energy surveys for people. So when we design the messaging for this, the shared destiny messaging is that we have trained 68 Surrey residents to help their neighbours and communities reduce bills and keep their homes warm and healthy. Okay, so that is the shared destiny. We're all doing this together. Like we know there's an energy crisis. We know that badly insulated housing stock causes health problems for people. This is what we're all doing about it together as a community. The co-benefits is that we're reskilling residents, so that sort of speaks to the green jobs co-benefit, and we're tying in residential emissions here, right? So it's not just, we're not ignoring climate change, we're still saying, well, actually, residential emissions are the second biggest emission source in Surrey. So here's all the things that we're doing. Oh, and as it happens, we're doing it because it tackles climate change, right? The normative appeal, over 580 Surrey residents have already benefited from an in-person energy survey in 2024, right? So people look at that like, whoa, 580 people have already done this. Clearly, it's working well. On top of that, we've had 130 respondents to the service. We've got a 4.9 star rating out of 5 stars. But the biggest part is that over 70% of those people have fed back in the feedback survey that as a result of the survey, they're more likely to undertake significant retrofit measures. So that is like way higher than I expected. That is a great thing to shout about. Multiple trusted messengers here because number one, we saw environmental charities were ranked third in trust. We're an environmental charity as it goes, so that's good. But we also have a lot of noise coming from local authorities on this. And as much as a lot of communities don't necessarily like local authorities, they do act as a good source of trust. And trust in energy projects is really crucial because there's a lot of scammers that come out the woodwork when government funding comes out. So it's really helpful to have that badge on it. But most importantly is the trusted messenger here is word of mouth from residents who have already had the survey. And we have a I haven't included it here, but we have question, where did you hear about this? And social media is still the top, but just behind it is word of mouth. Can't underestimate how important it is that people do this, right? And then the call to action here, I did mention this earlier, but the call to action is not having an energy survey. It's free, right? Everybody wants an energy survey because it's just a free thing. People are interested. We come around with a thermal imaging camera. It's fun to look at. Like everybody likes it. It's a bit perverse, really, but everybody enjoys watching the heat and therefore money escape from their home. So although that's not a good thing, people really like it. So we don't really need the thermal imaging cameras. That's just a good hook to get people with. But the call to action isn't have a survey. It's what we do after that survey that's important. And that is get people to decarbonize their homes. And there's two options there because obviously we've got an able to pay market who we might set up with a retrofit assessor. And then we've got all the people who would qualify for boiler upgrade scheme, Eco 4, home upgrade grant, etc., etc. So how we funnel those people in the right direction is absolutely key, right? And the other part of that we're trying to do is collect people who might be interested in driving forward bulk purchasing schemes in their community. So we actually run a bulk purchase solar project right across Surrey as the council, but we're also looking at a smaller scale neighbourhood scheme, so 30 to 50 houses where we can bulk purchase to make things move forward quicker. And then continual escalation through the networks. In this case, it was easy. It's not always that easy to do this, but in this case, for example, we've got councillors who are involved. We've got Uni of Surrey, who we do a lot of work with. And if you've got a local uni, honestly, I can't say what a blessing it is to work with them sometimes. Parish councils, we've got some of them running the surveys. We've got our own newsletter, which is the third. We've got quite a big reach on that, and that's the third biggest source. But the biggest thing that we had was I did a short snippet for a bulletin for BBC News, BBC Surrey News, just thinking it was going to go on the radio, and they turned it into an article on their news website, and it was the main article on the homepage. And I woke up on the Sunday to my phone going absolutely nuts. Looked at it, it's like, what are all these surveys coming from? And without telling us, they turned it into a bit of editorial, which was like unbelievable. Obviously, if you've got the best trusted messenger you can get, obviously, is going to be a main news site saying, look at these guys offering a free thing. That compared to our paid advertising on Surrey Live, where it was obviously an advert, even though it said free, the difference in the level of trust there was unbelievable. I reckon BBC News generated at least 7 or 8 times more leads than our paid advertising, which we put £1,600 towards. So that, like, the difference in a trusted messenger saying it versus us paying someone to say it was enormous. So this is tying all of what, if you thought, oh, this is a lot to remember, if you take one thing away, this is the path of how to design pretty much anything you're doing, how you have conversations, how you chat to people on an outreach stall, what you put up on a wall of a climate hub, whatever it might be. If you can bring these 6 things into it, you're already onto a much bigger winner than you probably were to start with, unless you're already familiar with all of this. And then just in terms of escalating, this is sort of the little pyramid that we use in terms of how to get things going, which is different for everybody, but it is worth you mapping out this so that when you think about how to escalate projects, you think about who you can partner with, that you've got the same shared objectives with, what public sector and education you can engage with, which businesses are supportive, what frontline services, these are community link officers, borough and parish councillors, and then other councillors. It's really helpful to map some of that out so that for certain projects where you know you're going to find people who align, you can quite easily maximize the reach of that. It makes a huge difference. I'm nearly done, right? I'm going to go on to resources in a minute. But the main things to take away, to put into practice straight away, number one, stop framing climate change as an environmental issue. It's a health issue, it's an economic issue, it's a social crisis, right? It's all of those things as well as an environmental crisis. Don't use words or motivation just because they connect with you, right? And nobody likes to hear this because obviously we've all got this branding through places, but even words like green, eco, save the planet, well, immediately you're not getting past that first blocker of disengaging people from the off. Nobody wants to change a long established brand, but if you've got those things in your main headings, wordings, plastered on a shop wall, whatever, it will straight away make some people, because of identity, because they don't identify as an environmentalist, be like, that's not for me, right? It's really important. And if it means you have to go back and rethink it, it's a major bummer. It's, I'm not telling you to, that's completely down to you, but it is a blocker. It's known to be a blocker. Peer-to-peer engagement, absolutely key. However many people you can get from as many different backgrounds, as many different types of identity, engaging on what you're doing, absolutely key for the bringing in more people that trust you. And then optimism, real catalyst for change. And what is difficult here is it's very tough to be optimistic when we're talking about climate change. And what we're not saying, right, just like we weren't saying give up your own values before, but just reframe them slightly, we're not saying sugarcoat that everything's going to be okay. What we're saying is start the conversation in this other way, so that once you've started getting that person engaged, it's much easier to emphasize the genuine scale of the problem. Once you've started talking to people about how it actually will impact them, and they're thinking, shit, actually, this is going to really impact something I love, someone I love, a place I love, it is much easier to then emphasize the true scale of climate breakdown and what it means in terms of that. But if you start with that, you've lost them pretty much right from the start. So it's building that conversation. It can happen pretty quick, but if you launch into it straight away, you've pretty much lost them. And then turning that into actual practice on the ground. This is the exercise that we run in the session 2 of our engagement. So this is the sort of flow of a conversation. Now, obviously, you don't want to be reading off a card when you're having a conversation, because authenticity is a key part, but nobody gets to this point of remembering all this without a bit of practice. So we do a bit of role playing, and this is why I'm not sure role playing would work this well on here, because it's quite awkward. People don't really like role play, but actually the first time we did this, we were quite surprised by how much people got into it. And so what we're looking at is this flow through a conversation. You start with the catch-alls so that you don't alienate people. A cross section of these main motivators, so that you've got people across a number of personas hooked. Then listening, absolutely the key part of here. What is it they're saying? Can you identify in what they're saying what persona type they are, so that you can specifically come back with a particular value that you know they would be interested in? For example, I can't believe how much Ben Van Buren from Shell, for example, is making. You could make an estimated guess that it would be sensible to talk about unaccountable corporations, because that could well be a loyal national talking to you there, right? Responding with an authentic response. So yeah, I totally understand what you're saying there. This is why I'm involved with it. This is my authentic story, but here's how it ties into your thing, and here's a call to action so that you can actually get involved in what we're doing here. Now, this obviously isn't a 1-minute conversation. It's trying to build this over time. So you're not going to succeed in this every time. It's literally impossible. But if you take away one thing here, it's to remember to start something with a resonating safety net, right? So talk about the things that we've mentioned before, so that you try and hook a wider section of society. And then I'm just going to give you a couple of examples, because at the start I posed the question, why do some projects work and why do some projects not work, right? So I'm just going to give you 2 examples here of why I think a couple of things work really well as projects. Residential energy surveys, I've already talked about quite a bit. Firstly, let's not underestimate the fact that it's always in the news, right? Nationally amplified message in the energy crisis. So straight away, people are better educated on this than some other things. It's whatever newspaper they read, it's always in the back of their mind, right? It's got excellent health messaging. Poorly insulated housing stock results in damp, condensation, results in mold, results in poor health, particularly respiratory illness, more pressure on local health services. It's really good for creating provincial norms, because loads of people want one. So straight away, you can launch in with, 581 Surrey residents have had this service. It's got a 4.9 star rating. It supports residents who need the help in a collaborative way without using the term vulnerable residents. We don't need to say that at all. People reject vulnerability messaging, too much to go into here, but particularly in the 2 disengaged brackets for different reasons. And it offers a common sense problem to a solution, right? And then it ties in the shared destiny with the co-benefits on reskilling, green jobs, etc., etc. That is why that is a successful project. Obviously, it's a free energy survey, so it's easier to make it successful, but that is a lot of the other reasons why it works. Community fridges get lots of traction. Probably the most popular thing we post about on social media. People always pile in, share stuff about community fridge when we've got a load of food. Waste, part of the reason here, when you look through the Britain Talks climate stuff, waste is a really unifying message. Ending throwaway culture, good unifying message, regardless of what your motivation is. It offers a common sense solution to a problem again. It's got a measurable impact, which creates provincial norms. So, for example, 9,000 people visited our fridge in 2023, whatever it is. And again, it supports residents who need it, but the theme is around food waste. So we never have to say it supports vulnerable residents and it helps build relationships. But most importantly for us, obviously, it reduces a lot of CO2e because food waste is like got a really high carbon emission factor. So for us, it's a no-brainer to share this, really. So when you think about some things that work and some don't, if you started digging into it, you'd probably find that the projects were successful, had a lot of these factors, and ones you thought would be great but didn't really resonate aren't touching on as many of these things. So wrapping it up, I'm just going to go over resources in a minute, but wrapping it up, right, this is probably a lot if you weren't familiar with any of those concepts. Absolutely fine. If you don't remember any of this, absolutely fine. But hopefully it's been at least sort of interesting and thought-provoking enough to come back and start learning it for yourself, because this is, as I said at the start, a real journey. There's no silver bullets to this. If there was, we'd all be nailing it. We'd all be engaging 100% of our local communities. So at least go away from here, read the Britain Talks climate summary. If you click on climate outreach, click on the tab that says resources, drop down, says Britain Talks climate, and then the summary comes up. Think about what local experts you've got, particularly on behaviour change, because I can't overemphasize how useful they can be. So if you've got a local university or college with sociology, whatever it might be, if you can't, reach out to others. Worst case scenario, I'm sure we can probably find some that would love to help. Get your team together and brainstorm the 6 points I mentioned on each project, and then practice this. You will never always get it right. Don't worry when you fail. My local co-op thinks I'm extremely strange because of conversations that I practiced at the surplus food going out of date bin that I kept getting wrong. So I sort of like not banned officially from co-op, but they definitely give me a funny look when I go in. It's not something you can just do by reading. You've got to get out and practice, and it's not for everybody. That's absolutely fine, but if people don't want to do this, they shouldn't necessarily be the person that is the first people chat to if they come into your building or to your stall or what have you. So find the people who are really up for this. Think about how it works for your local community, what those local impacts are, and then try and push it forward that way. Pretty much done there. You'll be glad to hear. But I've got a load of resources for you. So, oh, sorry, that's got 2 slides on it there. The thing that you should be able to see behind there is a little mapping exercise. This is the homework between sessions 1 and 2, in case you fancy doing it. So we give the catch-alls in there, and then we talk about specific messaging for our projects in there. The next one is the project assessment. So how well things are working with barriers in Combi. We have role play cards, which you can fill in for your own projects. We use these 3 as examples. And what these do is we give on 2 sides. We've got 2 sides of the card, the person walking into 0 and the volunteer in 0. And we give the person walking in specific pointers within one of the persona types. And then we give a couple of sort of like clues on the other one of what the person is saying, and they have to respond to the conversation based around shared values. You're welcome to take those and use them how you like. You can take this conversation flow, which on the back of it has an example of how this might work. If you want it, we've got a load of stuff. You're very welcome to have it. We're very welcome to do another session, which would be effectively what we do in workshop 2 of this. Yeah, that's sort of it, really. You'll be glad to hear me stop talking at you. Hopefully interesting, hopefully a lot to take away that's quite thought-provoking. I do realize it was a lot, but please don't let that make you think this is too much for me to do, because it can be little steps, but I honestly can't oversell how important it's been to us in Surrey in getting some of the traction that we've got going in what is quite a difficult environment to engage people in, I think. So I'll shut up.
Thank you, Ben. That was great. I'm sure somebody got something from, we all take different things, don't we, when we get a presentation like that. So if you could put the link in the chat as well for anybody that's interested in, the follow-up sessions and doing a full workshop with Ben, we can just put that in the link as well. And if there's anybody that, before we close, wants to feedback on anything, whether in chat or take yourself off mute, and any kind of questions or any other feedback there.
Hello, thank you so much, Ben. It's been very, very helpful. Thank you. Very interesting. I had a question about the normative statistics. I was just wondering if you somehow get some stats which say, well, 15% of people are doing this. Is that going to be a helpful one, or does it have to be like over the magic 50? Is it as crude as that, or it's probably not that simple? But any thoughts?
Oh, it's a really good question, I think, and I was toying with this a little while ago as well. Is at what point do you sort of not use it as a normal thing? Because ultimately, like in a lot of things that we do, there's obviously a massive difference in how much people want to do something versus how much people are actually doing something, and that's obviously a part of the reason we're in such a dire situation at the minute. And it sort of goes back, there's that cartoon, isn't there? You know, put your hand up if you want change, put your hand up if you want to change, and it's a huge disparity between the two. That's sort of exactly where we're at. I think probably yes, if it was like, well, 8% of your fellow residents are already doing this, it's probably not worth shouting about too much. But equally, but it's that whole willingness to contribute, right? People probably aren't doing it because they don't think other people are doing it. But if you can emphasize this a lot, and this actually was like probably a lot of you will remember this from the start of XR stuff as well, was the whole conditional commitment thing. That is a real thing. That is the willingness to contribute, right? If you can figure out how you could say, look, if 500 other people in your community would do this action, would you also get involved, right? And then you could use that to build a bit of a campaign around. Now, it's actually really difficult to find stats on this. The Nature one, I can send you the link to the Nature article, which is quite useful, but there isn't a huge amount of research on how many people are actually doing something. So I think it would be really worth us all getting out into the street and saying, you know, running some surveys to say, well, would you do this if X amount of people did this, basically? Because until you actually generate the numbers, it's quite hard to say it, and it's quite hard to find many statistics on it. So I think if you're running something that's pretty successful, make noise about it with particular numbers. And if you haven't got that many people on board at the minute, start doing surveys where you can look at that conditional commitment part of thing as well, because I think that is quite important. And especially with active travel, I think is like, none of us want to walk or cycle if it's dangerous, but let's say 1,000 of us committed to driving once less a week. If we knew, we would commit to driving once less a week if we knew 1,000 of our fellow community members were doing that as well. What would the impact of that actually be if we actually did it? So I think again, we haven't cracked this all entirely, but I think it's well worth a lot of us experimenting with to see what we can land on that works quite well. That's probably hasn't really helped you very much at all, I'm afraid, but I would say at least 50% in short answer to your question.
And the conditional commitment, I'm afraid I don't know that actual phrase
Okay.
actually. So did you say you've got a resource about that?
No, well, so it's sort of like if this number of people in your road did something, would you also do it as well? And that still
Yes.
comes back to the social norming sort of factor as well. So that
Yeah.
is really just more surveys in a nutshell. It's just saying to people, would you do this if all these other people were doing it as well? And I think although that doesn't necessarily in itself drive action, it's the starting point to get a number where you could start talking about something. Because if you don't have the number to start with, how are you going to go about doing anything? Because you can't get all those people to do it without figuring out how you're going to get a critical mass to do it. But if you could say, right, this number of people are going to do it, let's actually do it, you've got a bit of a better chance of doing it, I think. So that's
And do you
conditional
think your
commitment.
a university behaviour change specialist would help us sort of put together sort of workable phrases like that to sort of pitch it right? Because
Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah, we're actually about to start doing quite a lot on an online project with them as well. So if I get any useful information and we have a place where we can centrally pull stuff, then I'm really happy to share it if it's useful to people, because we should get some useful stats out of it.
Thank you
And we
very
can
much.
also share any of this new information you get through the SECA newsletter. So it's some way of being able to kind of like continue with this new data information that you have. And I think Ali had a question.
Hi, Sally.
Hi. Yeah, just following on from that, we're doing a sort of active travel project at the moment, and I'm thinking that having this survey information would be really helpful. But do you think just going out on the streets and asking people is probably the best way to get going with that, and just do a quick small survey, because the chances of getting a proper representative survey that would be a pretty big task. Do you think
Yeah.
just
What is it you're trying
going
to
out?
do?
Sorry.
What are you trying to do with the project?
Well, we're trying to develop a local cycling and walking infrastructure plan for our parish on a local scale. Yeah, but to have something that said, for instance, so many percentage of people in Steyning would cycle or walk to the shops if they felt safe to do so, or that kind of thing. I think feeding in those sorts of figures makes a lot of sense and helps people, as you say, it helps to normalise it.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think if it's parish level, you could have a good crack at getting a pretty representative number of people, because you probably got what, like tops 5,000 if it's a parish of you? How many
Well,
people
I
have
think
you got?
we're probably around 7.5 in the parishes we're talking about.
Okay. So, I mean, if you could get enough people, I don't know how many folks you've got down there who are quite engaged, but if you could get enough people out and about, standing around at the shops, maybe doing a bit of door knocking if you're allowed to do door knocking. We're not as a local authority, but I don't know what the rules are for parish councils are. If you could get a decent size survey, I think you'd probably get pretty good results. And obviously how you put that across is quite important as well, because we saw the impact of, how we frame the conversation in the call to action. So what leads up to that? Would you cycle? Don't have to make it a leading question necessarily, but if you talk about why you're doing it to start with and what the impact would be. Road safety is a big one. Like, a lot of people die on the roads. Air quality, all of these things, getting out and seeing the countryside in a safer way. All of these things are really important. So perhaps what you could do is, rather than make it a leading question, is you could lead in with a paragraph and then have a little ranking of what is most important to people. And I think when people know it's about their own parish and the sort of micro local level, they'll be pretty likely to engage. It does mean putting someone out on the streets or multiple people out on the streets for a while, but I think you get good level of engagement with that, and work out what a representative level is. I think that would be really useful to you, and I'd be really keen to see what you get out of it as well.
Yeah, thanks. That's worth thinking about.
Richie, you got a question?
Yep, sorry, just unmuting myself. Ben, I was really interested in the overall message really in stop framing climate change as the environmental issue, and then at the end the words to stop using are like all the words that we've been using, basically. We had an eco fair at the weekend, and it was well attended. I was pleased. But obviously we were getting that audience that will come to an eco fair, and it was becoming quite apparent, it was likened to like a heat pump owners sort of reunion meeting, rather than getting people in who don't know what a heat pump is and that sort of thing. So I mean, obviously, well, what would you suggest for something like that? How, with something where you're trying to push the environmental issue and the carbon reduction, how can you change the wording but still have the things behind it that are going to help reduce carbon emissions?
Yeah, so what's interesting, right? So obviously I'm saying stop framing it as an environmental issue. Obviously, environment and nature and wildlife is still like a real key motivator for people, because we saw it was across the top there. So it isn't that you can't talk about it at all. It's that we just need to think about what messages will actually work with people. And the second interesting point here, right, is with our energy survey project, we've been asking people what their main motivation is. And cutting carbon emissions is actually coming out as number 2. Saving on bills is number 1, but it's quite encouraging that cutting carbon emissions is number 2. So people are motivated to do stuff, right? But there's a big difference in what people say on a poll compared to what they actually go away and do. And that is why the co-benefit thing, which we're often talking about when we frame things, we're often just using a co-benefit instead of that broader shared destiny, right? And one thing that's quite a good way to look at this is independence. So we all know the phrase "take back control, right? Probably most of us here don't care for it very much, but it was extremely effective because it spoke to independence, right? And that is when we think about that in terms of climate, energy independence is a good way to actually think about this, right? And we have have a bit of an ongoing battle with this in like local. Well, you mentioned the Great Victory at Broadford Bridge at the start, but there is a common narrative that drilling for local oil and gas will cut bills for people locally, and that's not true because of how oil and gas markets work. But local large solar farms, for example, would potentially cut bills for people. So talking about that, if we can get local electricity bill and that across the line, etc. So talking about that energy independence for local people can be a good way to engage a section of people who wouldn't necessarily get involved for climate stuff, but also the bills part is really important, and then tying that back to health is also extremely important. So for heat pumps, for example, you wouldn't necessarily see any health benefits from the heat pump, but the associated upgrades that you would probably make in insulation to start with have a real good health messaging alongside them. So one thing is it's always tricky to get people to take the effort to come out to something like an eco fair. I think you'll always struggle with something like that, but going and meeting those people that you're trying to engage where they are is potentially a different way to frame the messaging. So we have in Surrey we have, like, using the index of multiple deprivation, we have 21 key neighborhoods, right? And what we found with the energy surveys is I think the majority so far of surveys, it's like over 30% basically, have been detached houses that have applied. Now, most people did not get into surveying houses so they could go and see how they could save people with detached homes more cash. They wanted to try and help people who needed support as well. But what we haven't done yet is go out to those key neighborhoods to try and remove some of the barriers, digital exclusion, so people don't see us advertising online, and lack of tech literacy, the time to actually even apply, because the survey form takes a few minutes. So if you've got lots of other problems. So what we're going to do now that it's warmer and we are going to be less busy is go to those key neighborhoods, set up in the community hubs, and start talking about the project in the terms that are more likely to relate. So saving money on bills, health, etc. So I think you're always going to probably come up with, we all run things like that, eco fairs, stalls, what have you, where we're probably disappointed that we're just, talking to the converted or what have you. But going out and actually setting that thing up in a way that will engage people in their local space and remove some of those barriers is a much more effective way. So if it is on heat pumps, lots of people may be eligible, say, for boiler upgrade scheme. They probably need insulation upgrades first, but they'd probably be eligible for Great British Insulation Scheme first. So if you can look at it like save money on your bills now, you'll save a lot of money in the long term. You don't have to pay any money towards any of this. Well, boiler upgrade scheme, you would potentially, but the insulation part you wouldn't. And then the health impacts of that, plus the cost savings, can be a really good way to do it. But we still can't expect people to come out to us just because we've changed the narrative on things like that. Like, they still have a lot of barriers to do it. So that is why looking at all those barriers when you're trying to do an engagement activity can be really useful, because you'll probably find you come up with 20 or 30, and by the end of it you think, Jesus, how are we actually going to get this message across to lots of people? But it does help you start thinking about it and think, well, this is a barrier we can overcome, so what should we do about this one particularly? And that will quite often be go and meet them where they are. So I think it's a challenge. Like, I don't think we can get disheartened about people not coming to events that we hold, because it's an effort to get there. But going and meeting people where they've got less barriers is key, I think.
Yeah, no, agreed. And doing both maybe as well is sort of covers all parts of the market, or the spectrum.
And also, I think if you call it an eco fair, straight away there's a lot of people who probably won't come. But if you theme it around, like, think about how many people go to a village fete. It's tons. We have a teddy bears picnic here.
Yeah.
It's themed around a teddy bears picnic. I've been in charge of the raffle because it's my youngest's last year at the school, and I've been roped into organising because I've slacked off in the years before. So I've basically just organised a ton of no prizes. Basically, it's all experience prizes or tours, so it's really lowered the impact. And I've snuck somebody in that I know to come and do an environmental impact assessment of the actual fair. Haven't told anybody this yet. Hopefully there's no one on here from the committee. But those sort of things, like, literally thousands of people go to that, and it's about teddy bears. And then we put something on we think is really good, and you get 20 people show up. So I think it's just not being disheartened and trying to figure out, how do we actually get in there and do some of these things, and then shout about it afterwards.
I think I also want to add in, just recently with the rivers trusts, how, you know, there's such a passion for rivers wherever you know, all across the board.
Definitely.
And we recently had the Rother and Arun Rivers Trust come, and it was absolutely packed. In fact, it was so packed that they had to rebook it 3 times, and I didn't know a soul. And so, you know, going into my local village and going, wow, look, who are all these people? But they all came because they wanted to learn about the rivers. So,
Yeah.
you know, those kind of, also harvest fairs. There's so many other hooks that we can use instead of that, you know, the eco green climate, and that is what the branding is, rather than, you know, trying to say really broaden it out and talking about our rivers or our local landscape. And because we could see that as well, that majority interest is in nature. So if we actually create these gatherings around whatever our local natural feature is, then, you know, that can be another really good way to engage, as was really evident with the Rivers Trust. So
Yeah. It's a bit of a bummer, isn't it? Because like we talk about how strong identity is, and obviously we all build like really nice communities where you have loads of nice people all interested in the same thing. And like you don't want to give up your own identity really to start bringing other people in, but ultimately we're trying to deal with a crisis that's so massive that needs everybody involved in it. You know, it's a bit of a double-edged sword really. You don't want to ditch your long-term names or branding or what have you, but ultimately if we're going to succeed, we've got to bring those people in. And I completely agree on rivers. It would have been the third thing that I included as a project at work, because we have over 200 people trained up to test 190 sites across the way in Tillingbourne, and we've just launched. Well, actually, on the 27th, we've got an E. coli testing lab now, which the Uni of Surrey validate. But nationally, going back to that nationally amplified message, wildlife and nature. So again, going back to that shared value, it's like local leisure economy that you get from your waterways. So it's that shared destiny narrative with all the co-benefits, and it's like the unaccountable corporations part of it. Why are they making so much profit when they're dumping sewage into our rivers? That brings that loyal national part along as well. So when you actually break it down in line with the Britain Talks climate stuff, it honestly, for me, it was like a real light bulb. It makes so much sense when you do it. I honestly think it's worth putting the time into understanding it.
So we've
Or I
got
wouldn't be
one
here
final
talking about it.
question here, Ben. Is there a better name for a climate hub? Paul suggests a healthy, money-saving nature hub. But how can we extend that? I mean, I know at SECA we've had the discussion, you know, it was set up as the Southeast Climate Alliance, but, you know, actually when so many more people are interested in the environment, that, you know, changing it to the Southeast Climate and Ecological Alliance, because that incorporates those people that are really interested in the ecology and the wildlife, but aren't so engaged with climate issues. And so, yes, that broadening, isn't it? So
Yeah.
as soon as we say climate hub, it straight away is kind of put into that bracket.
Yeah, it's really difficult as well. The highlight, it's all right when you talk about projects. It's actually not that difficult to reframe stuff for project level. When you talk about the higher level stuff, it's actually really, really difficult. And we call Zero a climate hub. We pretty much universally hate the term, but we don't have a better thing to call it.
I mean, why can't we just call them community hubs?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
because really a community hub is what this is about.
Yeah,
You know, we're
exactly.
identifying that we're talking about health, we're talking about energy, we're talking about food. So, Jeff.
But I don't know about this, because we started at the beginning, Ben, about saying how many people actually realize climate's a problem. So why is the word climate a problem?
So it's that they were worried about the thing, but they don't necessarily identify with what they see climate activists doing, right? So regardless of what sort of people perceive Zero as, it is a load of people who fall into a couple of personas, and we're fairly broad, I suppose. Part of our lottery funding that we got, that wasn't from a climate action fund, it was from reaching communities, which is, I think, really useful in trying to mainstream some of this. So the term in itself, the climate is less problematic than like green or eco. I think green has political connotations. Eco obviously just has its own connotations. Save the planet is like in the Britain Talks climate stuff is the biggest no-no basically that they say disengages people. So it isn't necessarily just a word, it's people identifying with that thing. They'll just think, oh, I am concerned about that, but that isn't the place for me to go, right? So it just doesn't draw those people in. They might think, oh, fair play to you, but they won't necessarily get involved.
Thank you,
And
Ben. Let
I kind
us
of regret
wrap-
the name Zero Carbon Guildford as well, actually. I will say zero fine, but it's like our work is called Greener Futures, which like I constantly going on about that. But once you're set, like it's quite difficult to change it. And as I say, the high level things are really tough without using those words, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry to speak over you there, Nicola.
No, not at all. I was just wanting to keep us on time. It's been 2 hours, and and we could carry on the conversation and keep going on and on. But yeah, thank you. You've put your links in, and so anybody that is interested, we will have this recording. So those that could be interested in seeing this later, it will come out in the SECA newsletter with the link to the video, so we can then share that to others. So thank you once again, and thank you, Jeff, for helping hosting it. And anyone that is not already a member of SECA, then please do go and join up either as an individual or as a member organisation if you're in Sussex, Surrey, Kent or Hampshire. And have a good night. So thank you, everybody. Good night.